Welcome back to Ramblings of a Mathwoman, a podcast where I talk about whatever shiny object happens to catch my attention for the week. So, last episode, I went a little mainstream and talked about chess, which was popular at the time because of the Netflix show, and I guess still is. So, for anybody keeping score at home, I'm still on trend. But before I start with what I wanted to talk about today, I wanted to add a little correction about something that I said last week. During a section where I talked about Judith Polgar, I mentioned that she played and beat, and I quote, a very famous chess player. Now, this was in reference to a guy named Garry Kasparov, and after some people heard the episode, they told me that Kasparov wasn't just a good player, but that he was and still is regarded as one of the best players of all time, and that for a very long time, like around when Judith played him, he was considered to be unbeatable, to the point where many people were way too intimidated to even play him. Now, I'm not fully immersed into the chess world, so I don't know these names when I hear them, so I'm really glad that I was corrected by somebody who is, because I do feel like it adds a little more intensity to the story. I also wanted to use this opportunity to mention that in case anybody ever hears me say something that isn't correct, please feel free to reach out to me on my Instagram, which is Ramblings of a Mathwoman, and let me know, because I will do my best to look into it and then correct myself in a future episode if I think it's necessary. I firmly stand behind my motto that pride has no place in science, and I want to make sure that I do my best to stay true to that. Okay, now moving on to today's episode. When I first started planning on what I wanted to talk about, I decided on cryptography because, first, it's pretty important because how information is kept safe when it comes to anything online, and then second, because it's really cool just as a topic how it all works. And I started to notice a pattern with all my topics, where I seem to always say that I'm talking about this because it's cool, but it's always true, I swear. All this stuff is just so neat and how it works and how everything falls together that I get really giddy when I start talking about it, and I want to make sure I project that to the listeners. But all of that was to say that I didn't really have a reason, so to speak, to bring up this topic other than I think that it's something that everyone should know and that I just want to talk about because I think it's interesting. However, as it turns out, by complete accident, I picked the perfect time to talk about this because it's way more relevant at the moment than I originally thought. So, for anyone that hasn't been living under a rock for the last, your entire life, you probably heard about the Zodiac Killer at one point or another. If for no other reason than because there was a movie made about him in 2007 called Zodiac. And I don't want to get too much into the true crime podcast territory here because I think that's better left to the professionals, but the short of it is that he was this killer in the 1960s to early 1970s that killed a bunch of people in the Northern California area, and there are obviously many details surrounding the case, but the thing that he was sort of most known for was taunting the police by sending letters to the San Francisco Bay Area press, telling them they had to publish his letters or that he would kill again. And the kicker was that 4 out of these letters were written in 2 parts. First part was in plain text, which is just regular text that you can read normally. But the second part was a cryptogram, which means that it was written in code that had to be deciphered in order to be read. And this was the big thing. You had this mystery killer writing to the press and telling them specific details of the murders that haven't been released to the public, and so proving that he is who he says that he is rather than just a copycat, and then hinting that if they can just decipher his messages, they can catch him. But even with all the methods that existed for tackling cryptograms, and there were a lot, breaking this code was really difficult. Don't quote me on the exact details of the case, but I believe that one of the 4 encrypted messages was decoded by a couple back in the 60s, like around the time that this was all happening, but the 3 that were remaining were a mystery for the last 51 years. Until about 2 weeks ago, where another one of his messages was finally decrypted. And this is early December 2020 for anyone who's listening from the future. The 3 guys who decrypted it are Jarlvin Ike, David Ornachak, and Sam Blake, and I really hope that I'm pronouncing these correctly because I'm kind of known for butchering names, but they are a programmer, an applied mathematician, and a software developer, and they have apparently been fascinated by this case for years. They actually posted a YouTube video explaining the software that one of them came up with and the methods that they used to go about this. So I'll make sure to include that in the description of this episode because it's definitely worth the watch. I thought it was really interesting and they explained it really well. It's really amazing that they managed to get this done, and I think this really goes to show that both the combination of technology and understanding of these algorithms can accomplish things that were seemingly impossible not that long ago. Now, unfortunately, the letter didn't really contain any useful information in it, such as an identity or anything that was hinting towards the identity. It was more of, honestly, crazy talk. There's just no nice way of putting it. But the most interesting part of the story isn't what was in the letter, but rather these new approaches that were used to solve this long-lasting puzzle that people were scrambling to figure out back in the 60s. Writing and breaking codes like this is still a huge field in both mathematics, programming, and security in general, and the people who are trying to create a secure code and the ones who are trying to break them are constantly working to outdo one another. As soon as someone comes up with a secure code that seems like it can't be deciphered, others will get to work on it and try to break it, and these algorithms that get used in the process while both encrypting and decrypting are really interesting and tend to come from many fields. Like, it's not just math and statistics that play a part here. A huge number of codes were actually broken by linguists, because the understanding of the structure of the language is extremely helpful when looking for the patterns. But I'll circle back to that in a bit. I think that the understanding of the general idea of cryptography first is probably necessary before we start getting into the actual methods. And then, as it turns out, that Zodiac code timing worked out really well for me because it provides a nice little segue for my introduction to the more complicated topics that I eventually wanted to talk about later, because the method of encryption that the Zodiac Killer used is a form of a more rudimentary encryption compared to the more advanced techniques that are used for heavy-duty security, I mean. This is not to say that the rudimentary codes aren't difficult to crack, because clearly they are, as it shows that it took us 51 years just to crack one of these letters. It's just that there are others that are significantly more difficult. Like, this one was cracked with modern technology and a team of 3 people working on it for a few years. Really strong encryption is not that simple to get through, but as a result, it comes with its own set of setbacks. To back up a bit more than just the 60s, encryption as a concept is not a new thing by any means. Sure, there are methods now that are used to encrypt messages that are newer and use newer approaches or technology, but the idea that information should be scrambled so that it's not readable by just anyone who comes across it goes all the way back to the 1900s BC in Egypt, and possibly even further back than that. Actually, one of the more widely known forms of encryption, that's called a shift cipher, is also referred to as the Caesar cipher, after Julius Caesar, because he was known to use it in his private correspondences. To explain what this cipher is a little better, if you were ever a kid and you tried to send your friend a message that was encrypted, chances are this is the one you came up with and used. It's one of the more simple ciphers and is literally just shifting the letter in the alphabet by some number, and then using those new letters in place of where the original ones should be. So to give an example, if you were to write the letters of alphabet in order, like the first one is A, second B, the third C, and then blah blah blah, all the way to the 26th Z, then right underneath it, you would write the alphabet again, but instead of writing A as the first, you would write it as the second. So your second letter, which was originally B, would now be A. And then you do that for the whole alphabet, and then when you get to the end, you would loop, and so your A is now Z. And then you use these letters to replace them where they would be in the letter. So this example uses the left rotation of one space. Since they are only shifted by one, if you wanted to decode it, you would just have to shift the order of the letters back by one. And you can use shift by any number to get a different series of letters you can encrypt with, as long as the number is less than 26, because at 26 you're just going back to the regular alphabet, and that's not really a secure code. Now, this number of rotations when encrypting is important to remember because it's what's called a key. Every encryption needs to have a key, because that's what you use to get the message back into plain text so that you can actually read it. An encoded message doesn't serve much purpose if you can't turn it back. Kind of like the Zodiac Message. It wouldn't have taken so long to know what he wrote had he been nice enough to just send a key along with the letters, you know? Now, this is that nice segue that I talked about. The Caesar cipher might be annoying if the letters are shifted by an adequately confusing number, but all things considered, it's not that difficult to break. It might be a good code, for example, to encode a password to your snack drawer or something small where too much effort isn't worth the reward for the other party, but you definitely wouldn't want to use it during a time of war to communicate with your allies, knowing that your enemy troops might be trying to intercept the letter and try to break it. In that case, if they got their hands on it, with enough effort, they could break the code, and then you would be in real trouble. And this is where encryption methods get more creative. Ciphers can actually be looked at in terms of two categories: classical and modern. Classical ciphers are like the Caesar cipher and others that were used by Greeks and Romans back in the day when cryptography was still in its infancy, and are often divided into two categories themselves, which is substitution and transposition ciphers. The difference between these two is that the transposition cipher, you still have all the letters that are present in the plaintext, except they are jumbled up and put in a weird order so that they don't make sense. And the way that people went about encoding messages using transposition were really innovative, actually. It wasn't just that they wrote messages backwards or jumbled up the letters randomly, but they got really creative with how to write it so that it's illegible to a random reader, but still easy to turn legible again so that the person it was intended for didn't have to waste a lot of time translating it back. One example of this that I love was used by Spartans, and they would send a messenger with a note that was encoded in transposition cipher written on the inside of their belt. That way the message wasn't only jumbled up, but it was also hidden out of view. In order to read the message, the belt would be wrapped around the staff that the messenger was carrying, and as it was wrapped, the letters would line up and you would be able to see in the plaintext message. And this only worked for the staff that was specific thickness, obviously, because if it was thinner or larger, the letters wouldn't line up properly and the message would just remain illegible. It was sort of a two-part security system, and I don't know, as much as I find the modern complex mathematical encryption algorithms fascinating, there's definitely something about these simpler ones that had to rely on this level of creativity in order to keep their messages safe that just really interests me. It just shows how big of a part creativity and thinking outside of the box really plays when it comes to, honestly, many things in a math field. I feel like it doesn't really get talked about enough in general. Like, little gadgets like this just make it really obvious how creative you have to be when you come up with algorithms. And this just holds true in general with math and these hard sciences that are usually seen as non-creative, even in cases that are purely theoretical. It's just these hidden details that go unnoticed but make such a big difference. But moving on, there was a little blurb about transposition ciphers. On the other side, there are substitution ciphers. And in these cases, instead of just mixing up the existing letters from the plaintext, you use actual different letters or even numbers and even symbols. You can use this either in place of individual letters or you can use them to replace entire words. For example, if you have a message that reads, "Send more troops," you can either substitute each individual letter in that phrase, or you could assign one symbol to mean send, another one to mean more, and then another one to mean troops, so you would have a letter that has just 3 symbols in it. Caesar cipher is an example of a substitution cipher, because even though you're technically still using the same alphabet, you're switching out which letters are used and replacing them with others. So it's still a substitution. And then you probably figured out that you aren't just limited to using one method or another, and that you can use them both in the same message. So you can use transposition and substitution at the same time, meaning you can switch out letters for something completely different, and then also jumble it up so that it doesn't appear in the same order. This gives it this extra oomph and makes it that much more difficult to decode. So a prime example of this is the Zodiac Message. I don't know if you ever had a chance to take a look at any of the ones that he sent in, but if you did, you would probably notice 2 things about them. One is that it had some weird symbols in it that don't resemble actual letters. Like there's squares with dots in them, and there's others that are circles with crosses, and then some other weird ones. But you also probably noticed that there's no spacing anywhere in the message. This is another encoding trick that gets used a lot to make it more difficult to decipher because it removes one method of attack, which is trying to guess some letters based on the structure of the sentence. This is where linguistics come into play, like I mentioned before, because if you understand the language really well, you can make some educated guesses. For example, if you have an encrypted message and you see that some symbols appear in 3s as one word, You can guess that those words probably are and, or for, or the, since those are very common three-letter words found in the English language. From there, you can substitute the letters from those words everywhere else, and then see if you can make sense and get some other letters from the context clues. Like if there are any other single letters that are on their own, they might be A or I. Then you would plug those in there as well, and now you have several letters that are kind of filling in the gaps. There are a bunch of little tricks like that people that work on breaking encryptions would try and see if it leads them in any direction that makes sense. From there, they might use something that's called frequency analysis to make further guesses. So for frequency analysis, you would take all of the symbols that appear in the letter and you would count them and then write them out in order of most frequent to least frequent. And from there, you would make some guesses. So the most common letters in the English language are E, T, A, and O. So the most frequently appearing letters in the cryptogram might correspond to one of these. Similarly, Z, Q, X, and J are the rarest. So the ones that appear the least might be one of those. Then the code breakers might also look for some doubles, such as EE, TT, FF, and SS, because those are common letters that appear in pairs. Or they would look for bigrams, which are letters that appear together but are not the same, such as TH, ER, ON, and AN, all of which are the most common. There are so many tricks like this that are used as an attack, but now imagine if you get a message where all the spaces are removed. You can still try to use frequency analysis in terms of finding the most common letter and the double ones, but you lose some of your tools by not being able to identify the simple ones that stick out, like the 1, 2, and 3 letter words. Now also imagine if on top of this, instead of using one symbol per letter, they switched it up and used some symbols to mean an entire word. Your frequency analysis suddenly falls apart. Granted, nowadays, computers made these tasks significantly easier when it comes to transposition and substitution ciphers, but can you imagine living back in the day and having to do this by hand? Like, it takes not only hours, but this can take months to figure out, and this is how it used to be solved. But these types of encryptions largely started falling out of use around the 1970s, after the development of new computer algorithms that made deciphering these a way easier task than it used to be. This is where the modern encryption algorithms started taking center stage because they had to be way more innovative so they don't fall prey to machines. They could try hundreds of key options in a few seconds that would otherwise take a human a much longer time to attempt. And now this is finally where we get into the new age of cryptography. I held off on talking about keys up until this point just so I can compartmentalize the topics that I cover a bit and don't end up throwing all the information in at once. But they actually play a much bigger part in this entire process than I expressed in the beginning. So to circle back to what I said before, keys are what's used to decrypt a message and take it from a cryptogram back to plain text. Normally, a key is something that you would give to the person that's supposed to be receiving your message on the other end so that they can decipher it without having to go through the pain of doing it by hand. So a key can be anything from 1 left, as it was from the Caesar cipher example I gave at the beginning, or any other level of increased complexity such as wrap the belt around a staff that's 3 inches in diameter, or even telling the reader that a letter should be read diagonally rather than from left to right, which was actually the case from the Zodiac's Message. But no matter what the rules for unscrambling are, there's always something that the person who's receiving the message has to have with them so that they can efficiently decipher it. And this is where it gets interesting again, because obviously, if you want to be able to send a safe encrypted message to someone, that means that you two must agree on the key beforehand, and then have that ready when you start writing the message. If you're, for example, trying to communicate with someone over a noisy channel, which means that if you're trying to communicate, but you know that there are people trying to intercept the message and are listening in between, then you can't safely send a key out, because if the people who are trying to listen and steal the message were to get a hold of the key first, then all of your encryption would now be useless. So it is necessary that this key was agreed upon beforehand, and usually in person, so that it is kept safe. But that's only in ideal situations. And as we all know, ideal situations are usually not how things play out. If you want to have an effective method for anything, you have to cater to reality, not hope. This is where the creativity comes up again, because knowing that this key delivery thing was an issue that would have to be addressed, people started thinking of how to go about doing this. If you can't securely meet with someone to exchange keys, then how can you effectively encrypt your information? This question plays a huge part when it comes to online security and sending messages over the internet, because as computers are communicating with each other, you're always assuming that somebody in between is listening and trying to steal information. Like, for example, when you log into your bank account, you don't want your computer sending out anything that can help break encrypted information out, because whoever ends up getting their hands on it now would be able to decrypt and get into all of your bank accounts. But then how do you send these keys so that you can effectively send encrypted information? So, as it turns out, a huge part of online security isn't only building algorithms that now can't be broken with machines that can try different approaches thousands of times faster than humans can, but it's also finding this safe key exchange between two systems. And this was a problem that people who dealt with cryptography and security have been aware of for a very long time. And there was this big search for what is called an asymmetric key. To help define this term a little better, a symmetric key is a type of key that I talked about up until this point, like the one for Caesar's cipher shift, try saying that 5 times fast, or the key where you had to wrap the belt around the staff. Any kind of key where the method of encryption could easily be applied backwards to decrypt the message. It's symmetric because you apply it in one direction to encode and then the other one to decode. Now, an asymmetric key would be one that you can apply it in one direction to encrypt, but then you can't use that same key to reverse engineer the encryption back into plaintext. You need additional bit of information that is kept separate from the key. This thought process gave birth to yet another category of cryptography that is known as public key encryption. And from this stems the security that goes into just about anything that happens online nowadays. Just like symmetric key algorithms that we talked about at the beginning of the episode, where I gave a few examples, but in reality we didn't even scratch the surface of all the other kinds that exist, it's similar for asymmetric keys. In general, there are just all types of algorithms out there that satisfy different conditions, and you select one based on what it is that you're trying to do. What I'm saying is, there isn't a one-size-fits-all algorithm that works well for all problems. You have to choose depending on the situation. And now finally, I'm ready to start getting into the main topic that I wanted to talk about. Everything that I cover up until this point was a light introduction so that I can get into this final part, which is the Rsa algorithm. Now, Rsa stands for Rivest, Shamir, and Alderman, who are the 3 inventors that came up with the algorithm. But those 3 names are often too hard to remember for people, so it's usually just referred to as Rsa. And this one is actually one of the first public key algorithms that was ever invented. I think the whole story around this one is actually really cool because the crux of how the whole thing works comes from a field of mathematics called number theory, which is pure math rather than applied. And the thing about number theory was, at least some years ago, it was that there was no actual application of it in the real world. Like, when I was reading about some of the famous theorists like Paul Erdős, who is one of the most well-known in the field, it was said that he would pride himself on the fact that he was doing math just for the sake of doing math, and that he didn't want it to have any application in any other field. And then RSA came out, and it relies so heavily on number theory, and I don't know. I guess it's so crazy to me that even this field that was considered to be so pure and have no applications ended up having this really important role to play when it comes to essentially all of online security. Which I guess is another reason why I love math so much. It has its fingers in just about every field, everywhere. Even in places where you wouldn't really think to look until you really started checking it out. Okay, back to RSA. If you ever get bored at home, I think you can make a really cool drinking game out of this podcast. Just take a shot every time I get off topic, and I guarantee you, first 10 minutes, you'll be drunk. But one of the things that RSA algorithm relies on is something that's called modular arithmetic. And the idea of this is really simple, actually. Modular arithmetic is kind of like division, except unlike normal division, where you care about how many times a number goes into another number, with modular arithmetic, you only care about the remainder. I'll give an example to possibly make things easier. So, let's say we're working with small numbers like 10 and 4. In division, if we have 10 divided by 4, we know that 4 can go into 10 twice. That gives us 8. And then we can't put any more 4s into 10 because they'll give us 12. But we can put half of it. So if we divide 10 by 4, we get 2.5, because it goes in twice and then a half more times. But now for modular arithmetic, it's the same starting concept as division. We just pick out a different part of the result. So to do 10 mod 4, which is how that's said, modulo mod, you'll see how many times you can fit 4 into 10. So you can put it in twice to get 8 before you can't put in another 4. And then from 8 to 10, you only have 2 that's remaining. So the answer to 10 mod 4 is just 2. To make this even a little clearer, like I said, in modular arithmetic, you only care about the remainder of the division. So when you divided 10 by 4, you got 2.5. And now in modular arithmetic, you only care about that half, which is half of 4 is 2. I hope that made sense. Obviously, this process of finding the remainder can get a bit trickier to calculate if the numbers are bigger, but if you have the general idea of how this works, then that's really all you need. And honestly, if you didn't get the general idea, then even then you'll be okay. It's just kind of nice because it helps bring the whole picture together later on when you hear the full steps of the algorithm. Now, modular arithmetic is a part of RSA, but it's not the key thing that makes it so revolutionary. The whole idea behind what makes RSA so unique and difficult to reverse engineer is the fact that it uses factorization of prime numbers to generate its public key. And to give anyone who's been out of school for a while a refresher, a prime number is a number that is only divisible by 1 and itself. And there are infinitely many prime numbers. There's actually a couple of mathematical proofs that show this, so if you ever feel the urge to look it up, I would say look either at Euclid's theorem or Euler's proof or Erdős's proof, and those are the only ones that I can think of off the top of my head. But the fact there's infinitely many of them is really good because this means that you can always generate new keys if you need it and never run out of numbers that you can pick. So the reason why these prime numbers make for good, secure keys is because, as it turns out, factoring a number into its prime components is surprisingly difficult. So what the RSA algorithm does is it has the person who wants to send a message come up with 2 very large prime numbers. And I mean large, like hundreds and hundreds of digits worth of large. And you pick such large numbers because the bigger it is, the harder it is to work out. If it's small, then you can work it out by hand. If it's kind of large, then a computer can work it out. But if it's really big, then even a computer can't do it in a reasonable amount of time, which is what you're banking on. So this person picks 2 prime numbers, and they don't tell anyone what they are. They keep them secret because these 2 numbers are what they'll need to use to decode the message back. These 2 numbers will be a part of what's called a private key. But now, because the factorization into prime numbers is really difficult, if these 2 numbers are multiplied and made public, then even though everyone can see this one number, and even though everyone knows that if they can just factor it out into its prime components, they would have a key for your messages, they still wouldn't be able to reverse engineer it because that is nearly impossible. When I say difficult or impossible and that a computer can't do it in a reasonable amount of time, I don't mean that it would take it like weeks or years. I mean that for a sufficiently large number, it would take a computer thousands of years to generate the decryption key. Like, it is not even worth trying. So you can sit here, send a message to someone saying, hey, here's this key, use it to encrypt a message for me, and have literally everyone see the encryption method. And the person at the end would still be able to receive it, use it, send a message back, and it would still look like gibberish to everyone who was listening in. It's the algorithmic equivalent of sending someone a box and an open lock, and then when they write their message, they put it in a box and snap the lock closed, and just because everybody else saw what the lock looks like when it's open, it still doesn't mean that they can generate a key for it. Come on, tell me math isn't cool. I dare you. Now, for the last part of this, I keep going back and forth between how much detail I can realistically get into for this algorithm before it starts sounding too confusing. And again, not because the actual algorithm is particularly complicated, it's actually extremely elegant, which is why it's so beautiful. But these things just tend to sound much more complicated than they really are when they're being talked at you rather than when you get to see it. Ideally, I would love to walk through an example that's simple using numbers, but I tried doing this a couple of times, and no matter what wording I would use, it just takes 5 times as long to cover the same point as I could cover if I could just physically show it. So I made an executive decision here, and I figured I can just give an outline of the locking and unlocking process, and then leave in the description a link to a very short video that explains it beautifully, in case anybody's interested in really knowing how it works physically with an example and real numbers. Okay, so now that you have all the individual pieces of information, the process of encryption is this. Say Alice wants to send an encrypted message to Bob. First, she would need to transform that message into numbers, because the algorithm that we talked about before relies on numbers. Like, there's no such thing as a prime letter, and you definitely can't perform any modular arithmetic on letters. There are many ways that she can do this transformation. She can either assign numbers to letters, like we did in the beginning with the Caesarean cipher, where A equals 1, B2, C3, and so on. Or she can use what is called the Ascii character code, which stands for the American Standard Code of Information Interchange, which is the binary representation of symbols, numbers, and letters, so just using zeros and ones. And then she would convert those into the decimal and use that as the number. The benefit of using ASCII over just assigning letters in order to numbers is that ASCII also contains symbols in its standard, such as question mark, hashtag, percent. So you don't have to agree beforehand on what every symbol is assigned to because it's already pre-assigned. But I think I digress again. So anybody who's playing the game, take a shot. So Alice has her message converted into numbers using whatever method she wants, and now she has to get the public key from Bob so that she can encrypt it. Bob will make the key by taking 2 really big prime numbers, like we already talked about, and we'll call those numbers P and Q. And then he will multiply P and Q together to get another number. Let's call it N. So P times Q equals N. And then he'll send N to Alice and keep P and Q private. He'll also need to send one more number to Alice so that she can really use it for encryption. The exact rules of this number is that it has to be relatively prime to Q minus 1 times P minus 1, but those are details. For now, we'll just call this number E for encryption. So Bob can now make E and N public and keep P and Q private. I keep stressing this because it's important. And now Alice can use them to encrypt her message. What she would do is take the first letter of her message, that is now turned into a number, and she would raise it to the power of E. And then, whatever value she gets, she would mod it by whatever the N value is. And then, whatever the result is at the end, that is now her encrypted value. So, she would repeat this process for every letter in the message. When she's done, Alice can now post that message publicly if she wants, and even though everyone can see it, only Bob will be able to decipher it, because in order to convert it from encrypted message back into plain text, he would need to use the 2 prime numbers to generate a new key that would help him decipher it back. I hope that encryption method managed to make sense, but if you didn't understand anything else from that explanation, which is fine because this is honestly just a cherry on top, I bet that you at least noticed that this process is rather tedious and time-consuming, meaning that even though it's secure, it's definitely not without its flaws. And this is kind of the trade-off. RSA isn't something you would realistically use as a human, but it's something that made a huge difference in how information gets sent over the internet. Now, when you log into your bank account from your computer reaches out to the bank server, asks for the public key, it takes the key, encrypts all of your information, and they can send it out to the server safely, all while everyone in between is looking and trying to steal the information. And the crazy thing is, sometimes they actually manage to succeed getting this information. And that's why this is so cool. If you remember, a couple of years ago, there was this issue with Target. And for anybody who's not an American listener, I know I have a couple of people. Target is a huge chain store. But they had a breach of security, and some 40 million credit cards had their data stolen. But nobody's information was actually compromised from this hack because everything that was stolen was encrypted. Without the key, the hackers could not decrypt the information. So all they had was just a bunch of gibberish that they couldn't do anything with. It's literally like stealing a safe that you are not able to open. I don't know. I guess I'll keep reiterating this. That's just really cool to me. Now, RSA fell out of use a bit after other methods came out that aren't as computationally taxing. Even though a computer can work really fast, this is still a pretty hefty task for it to perform, especially as the information that needs to get encrypted grows in size. It is still definitely in use, which is why I love it so much. It was one of the first to be invented and is still relevant today. But now it gets used to encrypt keys of other faster algorithms rather than it being the sole thing that is used itself. So this is normally what I would cover as my conclusion or final thoughts or anything else that I have to say about the topic, but I don't think I have anything like that for this episode. Everything's kind of wrapped up. It's mostly a presentation of algorithms that I find really interesting. So there's nothing I can say that can kind of close this out. I actually studied cryptography and RSA a bit while I was in undergrad, and it was with a professor who is just so good at number theory. I honestly considered switching from applied math to pure just so he can be my advisor. But in any case, I relied on a book that I used back then to remind me of all the details that I might have forgotten while I was thinking about this episode. So in terms of me recommending what a good read would be, maybe don't go with a textbook from school because, I don't know, those are very detailed and cumbersome and they're not a really fun read. If you're interested in reading something that gives a whole layout of the cryptography history, starting with the Mary Queen of Scots cipher all the way to the modern quantum cryptography, I recommend the Codebook, which is written by Simon Singh, and yet another name that I'm probably butchering. But it's a pretty interesting read, and it's not too technical, so you can kind of sit and just flip through it without needing a pen and paper present as you're doing it. And then I would also 100% recommend the YouTube videos that I mentioned earlier that explain how RSA works and how the Zodiac cipher was broken. Alright, thank you so much for listening. I hope that this topic was interesting and that it wasn't too long compared to my other episodes. I'll see you guys back here whenever. Bye.